Bu Filistin konuşmaları dahilindeki ilk sunumuna hoş geldiniz. Bugün benimle Al-Najah Üniversitesi'nden Profesör Hasan Ayoub birlikteyiz. Ben kendisine belirli sorular soracağım bir saatlik bir süreç boyunca. Ondan sonra seyircilerden de soru cevap kısmımız olacak. Bu dahilde siz yorumlara, sohbet kısmına istediğiniz soruları bırakabilirsiniz. Onları canlı yayının sonunda cevaplayacağız. So if you're ready, I wanted to lead off with the first question regarding the latest issues and the most recent happenings regarding the media buildings in Gaza. I wanted to ask, with the overwhelming presence of pro-Israeli media outlets, how do you evaluate the position of the Palestinian cause within international media?
Well, thanks. This is a very timely and important question, and it has to do with what one may call hysterical misgiving when it comes to Palestinians. That is, all the time, mainstream media, particularly in the West, in Western Europe, and in the United States, is being mobilized all the time in favor of Israel and in favor of Zionism. From the very early beginnings of the Zionist enterprise in Palestine. And it runs through all those years of almost 100 years of struggle in Palestine. Media in the West was all the time discriminate against Palestinians. So when it comes to the events of this current that I can call third intifada, third uprising, it's the same. So you have two different things in your question or in the topic that you started with. The first one is about how can one explain the massive military assault on Gaza with this extremely not only violent, brutal atrocity that Israel is waging against Gaza, and it includes media offices like Al-Jalaa Tower a couple of days ago, towers that house tens of Palestinian families, electricity and power generators, farms, development projects, which means that there is something here about every assault on Gaza was meant to destroy the possibilities of life for Palestinians and to give a clear message to all Palestinians that you can't challenge the might of the State of Israel. You can't challenge the ability of the State of Israel to inflict profound destruction upon you and to kill Palestinians in tens, including entire families. Actually, this is part of an old and still running theory in Zionism that Zev Jabotinsky put together in the early 1920s that is called the Iron Wall, which says that there is no other way to make Palestinians come into terms with Zionism and the State of Israel but to use a massive military force against them, to establish walls and to equip those walls with all kinds of weapons. Now, this is the first part of your, and so what we are witnessing here is not an assault against Gaza. What we are witnessing is also an assault against all Palestinians in the city of Jerusalem, in Nablus, in Ramallah, in the cities inside Israel, in Lud, Ramle, Jaffa, Haifa. So Israeli violence, Israeli brutality has never been exposed as it is today. So today Israel stands for what it really is. It's a discriminatory state inside Israel. It's a colonial settler power in the occupied territories. It's an ethnic cleansing power inside Jerusalem. And it's a war criminal in Gaza. This is what Israel stands for. And this is the way that we can see the events of today. Now, the second section of your question about media outlets in the West. One of the things here that explains is the ability of Zionism to mobilize huge resources and to use what they call hasbara, public diplomacy and so on and so forth, to flood media outlets with Israeli side of the story, if there is two sides of the story, because I see that we have facts and we have claims and allegations here. And what is being obscured in all this story is the very simple but really important fact that this is an asymmetrical situation where you can't use the term violence. You can't use the term war. This is not war. War, happens between two armies, two countries. Violence, when you talk about people just in some kind of a rampage against each other. This is not the situation. It's not violence. It's not a war. It's an atrocity. And it's an atrocity that reflects a struggle between a state who owns one of the most sophisticated armies in the world. It's a nuclear power, a state that uses almost 150 jet fighters, American-made jet fighters, with all those smart air-to-ground missiles, bunker busters to destroy Palestinian lives and buildings, against a people in the occupied territories. All in their disposal is very simple means of resistance. And when it comes to Gaza, who can come and blame the resistance in Gaza to use all in its disposal to defend its own people's lives, its people's right for freedom, for dignity, and to defend the Gaza that's been under very tight blockade for almost 16 years. So this is the problem with the media. They don't start from the point that they should start from. They start from today, which is completely misleading, and I would say it is deliberately designed to mislead people in Europe and in the United States and in other places in the world.
Thank you for your answer. I think it was very brightening. Also, one of the interesting, interesting is not the right word. One of the more revolting things that I witnessed in the past 2 weeks was a news story by New York Post. They reported on an airstrike on Israel that killed 20 people, 8 of them being children. And they claimed that it was Hamas doing this. Well, the story was obviously false for two obvious reasons. First of all, Hamas doesn't have an air force. They couldn't have done an airstrike. It's blatantly a lie. And the second part is that the photographs and the report itself was actually from Gaza, and the airstrike was actually by Israel that attacked. It was Israel that attacked Gaza and killed 20 people there, 8 of them being children. This is to which lows and depths the Western media can go to make a case for Israel that is simply isn't there. And I think this is not simply bad journalism. This is not simply unethical. This is inhumane. This is, I just found this to be a perfect example of how one-sided the Western media is. So my second question is, how should we interpret the ineffectiveness of international establishments like UN and ICJ and human rights organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch when faced with the Palestinian-Israeli conflict? Although these organizations have been passing verdicts in favor of a Palestinian state, these decisions remain virtually ineffective even today. Although UN has passed what I think is about 40 resolutions in favor of a Palestinian state, we're still lacking one. And Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, both very mainstream and conservative organizations, have found Israel guilty of war crimes, but there is no virtual action taking on the ground of these verdicts. How would you explain that?
Well, first of all, um, this world does not work the way we expect it to work. Not at least not all the time. And when it comes to Israel, there is some kind of exceptionalism. And the roots of this exceptionalism may be found in the history of the Jews in Europe, which is a history of persecution and of pogroms, and the whole story that you and everyone who's here knows about it. So one of our tragedies as Palestinians is that our battle against Zionism is a battle up the hill, because what stands behind Jews in Europe is a long history of being discriminated against. So, of course, this does not justify or explain the whole story, but this is a fact. This is a solid fact. Now, when it comes to Amnesty International or all those organizations, the question is about the ability of all those entities that you just mentioned to work freely or to have any kind of not only jurisdiction but some kind of effect has to do with the political will of major states, major governments in Europe and in the United States. So, for example, the Security Council of the United Nations has been trying to hold a session and to issue a statement now almost for a whole week. And the United States is preventing that. The United States is providing a shield for Israel in Security Council, and it provides this shield for Israel in so many organizations through money, through political power, through coercion, through so different means that would prevent those entities to take action. So this is why sometimes people, when they ask why it worked in South Africa and it's not working in the case of Palestine, look around you all over the world. Almost in every major capital in the world, including Washington, D.C., and so many states in the United States today. In Dearborn, Michigan, almost 200,000 protesters took to the streets in solidarity with Palestinians. In Berlin, Amsterdam, you just name it. So what it tells volumes about that the Palestinian cause, Palestinians still hold the higher moral ground in this struggle. And it stands anathema, it stands in some kind of contradiction with the position of the governments of those countries I just mentioned. So it's clear it's a struggle not only between Palestinians and Zionism and the State of Israel as one expression of Zionism. It's a struggle between all those peoples, all those civil society organizations, political parties, and even governments like in Turkey and elsewhere, who take a stand with Palestinians, and all those who stand in support with Zionism and with the State of Israel under the pretext that Israel has the right to exist. Israel has the right to defend itself. What about Palestinian rights to defend themselves? What about Palestinian rights to exist on their homeland as natives? So this is part of our struggle. It's a struggle on the hearts and minds of peoples all around the world. There is no other way to deal with it.
I think that what you said draws an important point. I think it is important to realize the difference between rhetorical action and virtual action of the countries. Many countries like Turkey or many Arabic countries speak in favor of Palestinians, but the government or the people, they speak in favor of Palestinians. There's huge amounts of support, but they lack the capacity to take action against Israel, to push them to cease their violent actions. And I think that difference between rhetoric, between political speech and political action is crucial to understand this case. So what you said about Palestinian right to defense brings me to my third point. In light of the most recent developments that we talked about going on in Gaza and West Bank and Sheikh Jarrah and Al-Aqsa Mosque, how strong is the possibility of any development towards the two-state solution?
Well, the fact is that we have one state between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River. That is the state of Israel. The state of Israel controls the space, resources, border crossing, all those modern media, first generation, second generation radio, broadcast, and so on and so forth. So this one state, in fact, practices its sovereignty, but in two different ways. One of them inside what is called Israel, and the other in the occupied territories. Inside Israel, particularly after enacting the nationality law in 2018, Israel has become, by its own laws, a discriminatory apartheid state, since it enacted a basic law that says that the only group who has the right for national self-determination is the Jews, not the Palestinians, not the Arabs. So there is no other way to call it but discrimination and apartheid. Whereas in the occupied territories, we have a dual system of laws that's being applied on Palestinians, and a different set of laws that is applied on Israeli settler colonials who live inside the occupied territories, including occupied East Jerusalem. So the fact is that we already have one state in the entire of Palestine. And to come under this situation and say, well, the only way out of this tragedy is to have two states for two peoples who can live together, blah, 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 and using the word, to have a viable Palestinian state. So go to all, political dictionaries all over the world. You will not find a definition of a state as a viable state. So you have, nation state, you have failed states, you have family states like in the Gulf, but there is no such a thing as a viable state. So taking into account Israeli control on the occupied territories, Israeli settlers who are now something like 750,000 Israeli settler colonizers in the West Bank, who live in the West Bank, bypass roads, regimes of control, and squeezing Palestinians into some kind of Bantustans, all of which tells us that there is no such a thing as two-state solution. It's done. It's over. It's not anymore there. But it's easy for for the United States and other actors just to say, well, let's maintain the two-state solution, because they don't have any other solution, because they don't come out and say that's it, finito. There is no more two-state solution.
It is interesting. I'm sure you've seen Norman Finkelstein's interview with Al Jazeera that was done, I think, a few years back. He claims that Norman Finkelstein is a radical supporter for Palestine, in his own words. However, he claims that there is no other solution than the two-state solution, because in the international law or the international politics, there is no mention of, or there is no support for the one-state solution or a fully Palestinian control over the area. So claiming that since there is no international support for a fully Palestinian-controlled area, there is no one-state solution. I think it disrupts the ethical core of the discussion. It is not only about what is politically available right now, but it is also about what is ethically correct. And but now this raises another question. How do you think that another solution than the two-state solution could be possible given the current international political atmosphere?
Well, first of all, I think if you ask Norman today about his position on this, most probably he would tell you something different. I will not put any words in his mouth. I know him very well, and I read most of his books. Um, Actually, what Norman Finkelstein and all those who think like Norman Finkelstein want is trying to, on one hand, preserving Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state on the one hand, but at the same time to come to a historical compromise, sort of historical compromise, and to enable Palestinians to have their own state. Now, with all those developments, no one can today come and say that there is a possibility for a two-state solution, because it was systematically destroyed and in front of the eyes of the international community, who came in the first place with this idea of a two-state solution, including the United States. So international community, including EU, Europe, and all states, including Turkey and Arab states, who supported all the time the two-state solution, they did not do any serious actions to hold Israel accountable for its actions and to force Israel to accept the two-state solution. So there is a contradiction here. Is at the same time, if you want to make such an aggressor, an occupier, a colonial state, to come into terms with international law, you should apply pressure on it. There should be some kind of a price for this state to pay. You can't, on the one hand, demand Israel or ask Israel to give Palestinians their rights, and at the same time, you have strong ties with Israel. You have, free trade with Israel. You have military relations with Israel. You have signed peace agreements with Israel, like in the Arab world, and so on and so forth. How in the world can you apply pressure on Israel? Comparing to South Africa, the point in which the apartheid system collapsed, that was the moment when more and more governments, not only peoples or nations, more and more governments all over the world, including the government of the United States, under the pressure of the Congress, at the anger of President Ronald Reagan at the time, they enacted what is called the Apartheid Act. Under that pressure, the apartheid regime collapsed in South Africa. There is no other way. So this is the contradiction here. If you really want to see this solution being materialized, you should have done something about it so long ago. Now, the hypocrisy here is that all those countries governments who still insist on the two-state solution, because they don't want to come out and say it clearly and loudly. Israel is a colonial apartheid state, and the only way is to dismantle this regime of discrimination and apartheid, simply because they don't want to stand in a position where they can be accused that they are anti-Semite or anti-Jewish or anti-Israel, or today anti-Zionist, because the new definition of anti-Semitism in the United States and in parts of Europe is equating Zionism with Judaism. And if you are anti-Zionist, then by definition you are anti-Semite. This is the kind of hypocrisy I'm talking about here.
I completely agree. So, and this then as well brings me to my next question. What is the role of armed resistance for Palestinian liberation in 2021? Political and military groups like Hamas and PFLP and PIJ held critical roles in the past decades defending the one state solution. And so, what is the role of armed resistance today, which is a time where the one state solution is rarely brought up, like we just discussed? How do we place the armed resistance organizations in Gaza or in West Bank or in other portions of the country or the Arabic Peninsula? What is their role?
Well, um, first of all, one of the biggest challenges for Palestinians is to try and envision a very clear strategy as to the struggle. And this is not because Palestinians are being divided. Palestinians, were divided for the last 16 years. They were not divided all the time. But the case all the time was that Israel, succeeded to create a situation in which Palestinians cannot wage a unified, integrated struggle against Israel. So, because part of Palestinians live inside Israel, another part lives in the West Bank, and then in the Gaza Strip, and the vast majority of Palestinians live in the diaspora in the Arab world. So it was very hard for Palestinians to adapt some kind of unified, consistent means of struggle, and that includes, of course, goals and demands for themselves. Now, when it comes to armed struggle, first of all, it's very clear. It's in international law, and this is not the Palestinians who put together. International law was not made by Palestinians. It was made by European powers after World War II. That includes the right of peoples all over the world to defend themselves by all means, including armed struggle against foreign control or occupation or colonization. This is what international law says. And the General Assembly of the United Nations took a resolution in 1974, and the number is 2237, I think, 2236 and 2237, in which it states clearly that Palestinians have the right to use all means of struggle, including armed struggle, to implement their right for self-determination. Now, the question is about political sensitivities of using armed struggle in the current day, when we talk about completely different balances all over the world, completely almost different international system, with all those changes that we don't want to get into in the world. Palestinians should be very careful when they use this means of resistance. Now, in Gaza is a completely different story. The only way in Gaza to defend their existence, to defend themselves against Israeli aggression, is to develop their ability to inflict some damage, to make it hard to Israel, and to make Israel pay some price when they attack Gaza. So that includes, by the way, for some law expertise, um, and it depends here, and it goes back to some kind of a case that was discussed in the World Justice Court, in which says that any nation or any entity, any state, any country who comes under such an aggression has the right to use all those means in its disposal, including nuclear weapons, to defend itself. So that's the position here. That's what's going on. What is happening today in Palestine, in the occupied territories and inside Palestine, tells volumes about the ability, the power of popular resistance, not that kind of popular resistance that sometimes our political leadership talks about. That's completely nonsense. The what you see as an intifada, people are taking up to the streets, with all those details. That's what I mean by popular resistance. That is consistent. It has a leadership. It is very well organized, and it aims at dispossessing the colonial power, from its authority. It's an act of defiance. So anything that can defy Israeli military occupation and colonialism, that can defy Israeli draconian measures against Palestinians, is very much welcome, and it's very legitimate. So that's, let me say, the contours of how to understand all kinds of resistance in Palestine.
Thank you. And I think it is important to mention to our viewers two things. First of all, when you look at the casualties from two sides over the last 40 years or since 1967, when you look at the casualties from both sides, the portrait is definitely asymmetrical. We cannot fairly speak of two sides because the picture is not balanced enough for us to mention two sides. It is an oppressing colonialist regime and people resisting it and defending themselves. Also, I wanted to remind something Edward Said said in his book, The Question of Palestine, to our viewers. He says that when Israelis attack the Palestinians, in media it is reported as the Israeli government attacked Palestinian posts, but by the Palestinian posts, they mean Lebanese refugee camps, while the Palestinians have any sort of armed resistance against Israel, they are usually defined as terrorists. This is how such an asymmetrical portrait is skewed in the media. And another thing I wanted to mention is that during the last events in Sheikh Jarrah and Al-Aqsa Mosque, there was an attack by what I think was PIJ, if I'm not wrong, which was actually coordinated by Hamas, but Hamas gave an ultimatum for Israeli soldiers to stop their attack on Al-Aqsa Mosque and Sheikh Jarrah, and it was a way that attack was a way of protecting their own ground. So we cannot define that as an act of terrorism. It was an act of self-defense, and this is why what I believe is usually misinterpreted in media. And you mentioned the third intifada. You called what's happening now a third intifada, which is interesting to me because I've been discussing this with my Palestinian friends over the past few days, whether it is right to call this the third intifada. So my question is, what defines an intifada? Because we had the first intifada in what I think in late 1980s, and we had the second intifada in early 2000s. What defines an intifada, and how and what should we expect from what you call a third intifada?
Well, that's a very good question, Tahsin. And my answer is not derived from my academic experience only, but it is also derived from my personal experience in the first intifada. So to know a little bit about my background, before I went to finish my higher studies and get my PhD, I was in Israeli prisons for a few years, and during the first Intifada, I was one of those who contributed to that Intifada. What makes an Intifada is first the participation of not only numbers. I'm not talking about numbers here. I'm talking about all Palestinians from all walks of life. Whether you want to define it in terms of classes, that includes, working class, middle class, intellectuals, young, old people. So this is one indicator that this is an intifada. When you look to people in the streets, you will see Palestinians from all walks of life. Number two, the spread of the events and the short time in which events took this momentum, and it's really a very, very short time. We are talking here about less than 2 weeks, and less than 2 weeks was more than enough to mobilize Palestinians from Jaffa, Lod, Haifa, Nablus, Hebron, Tulkarem, and everywhere. Number three, the slogans and the unity that you can witness when you observe demonstrations and marches. You see this kind of deep unity between Palestinians and the readiness to cross the lines and to break the fears. So you have so many aspects that that made me say that this is a third intifada. Now, I can't guess for sure for how long it's going to go. But what I can tell you is that we are very close to establishing unified leadership of the intifada. That's the element that is not existed now. And it did not exist in the second intifada. It was in the first intifada, of course. And the reason, because we have the Palestinian Authority. So for the Palestinian Authority, it is, until now, it refrained from making steps to push this popular intifada forward and to take the initiative and to take the leadership. They have their own reasons. And at the same time, they do not, the very presence of the PA is preventing the possibility to have political leadership for this intifada. But when it comes to subjective, criteria, we have all of those criteria, which indicates that this is a third intifada.
Thank you for your response. That was very enlightening, especially for me, because like I told you, I have been discussing this for the past few days, and what you say puts it in great terms. So my next question is, what is the role of BDS, boycotts, divestments, and sanctions within the terms of international law and human rights search, and how effective have the boycotts been? I am asking this because in that interview I mentioned of Finkelstein, as you will remember, he very controversially said that he doesn't support the BDS organization. So what do you think about the role of BDS and other boycotts and how effective they have been for the Palestinian cause?
Well, let's talk about something. Let me say tangible that took place a few months ago, when the protests in the United States erupted following the killing of Mark Floyd and the establishment of Black Lives Matter. And during this period, it was clear that Black Lives Matter, as wide range, as an array of organizations who came together to establish this kind of political movement. One of the main things in their political portfolio was condemning Israel for its, and they used the term genocide against Palestinians, and standing firmly in support of Palestinian struggle for self-determination. There is a long history of Black American struggle against discrimination in the United States, and the very close ties with Palestinians. The point here is that when it comes to what is called in academic life now, transnational social movements or transnational national liberation movements, like the one that was established during Black South African struggle against apartheid, or the Republicans' struggle in Northern Ireland against United Kingdom. They established their own transnational movements all over the world, and they played a very crucial role in supporting the struggle in homeland, whether it was South Africa or it was Northern Ireland. And now the same is going on with the Palestinians. Now, you can easily notice that the BDS succeeded in the last few years to not only to raise awareness, to make certain accomplishments, particularly when it comes to universities, to civil society, to media. So those all campaigns of boycotting and divesting from Israel were really, really successful. And the contribution of BDS in this sense is very significant, even in the very large scale protests that you see all over the world today. So this is a question of accumulation. Now, the only thing that is very important to notice that the first slogan of BDS, which is boycott, is not effective yet, because boycotting is the work of governments, not of civil society, not of universities. You can't come and apply sanctions on sanctions. Sorry, you can't come and apply sanctions by a civil society organization against a country. Countries can apply sanctions. So this is the kind of the dichotomy that I started to talk about. We have nations, we have peoples, we have tens and hundreds of thousands of people all over the world, but their governments still are not there. So the governments, like in Germany or in France, a couple of days ago, was no big difference than Egypt or any third world country who just oppressed protesters in the street of Paris. This is the problem with the BDS. It's not a problem, but this is the main challenge: how to bring things to that point where governments cannot ignore the activities and the pressure of the BDS. So in the United States, for example, the question of Palestine was never part of the public debate and the debate in the Democratic Party, for example, or in the Congress, as it has been in the last 10, 15 years. And I think one important factor in this was the work of BDS.
Well, thank you for your answer, and this directly moves to the next question. In which, and you started answering it with your last sentence, but in which fashion did the European countries and the US policies evolve during the last decade regarding the Palestinian situation within the terms of pro-Palestinian support amongst the youth and the Jewish population of these countries? Is it possible to expect a change in the respective policies of these countries or organizations?
Well, I may speak about, to some extent, about the United States. I'm not sure about the situation in Europe, but what I know about Europe is that peoples of Europe, including youth, are way, in front of their governments in terms of their support to Palestinians. And this is one reason why the Zionist movement, Israel, and some Western Europe countries applied, very hard measures on the activities of BDS, for example, like in France or Germany. Again, we are talking about the moral deficit that Europeans feel and live when it comes to the history of Jews in Europe. And this is one of the, you know, um, of the things that one should speak about loudly, um, which is the long history of discrimination that Europe represents. The history of Europe is a history of discrimination, of genocide, not only inside Europe, also outside Europe. It included not only Jews, like, you know, Africans in Congo and elsewhere in Africa. So the question is, it was not our fault. We did not do that. It's that simple. It's that clear. So, but still, this is the background against which very, many European countries hesitate and thinks twice, maybe three, and maybe 10 times because they take any action before they take any action against Israel. In the United States, it's, you know, it's in the media all the time, and I was following that. More and more Jewish young people, and I think it's in Europe, in Europe the same, are distancing themselves from Israel and Zionism. Actually, an important component of the BDS, which is Jewish Voices for Peace, it's a Jewish organization, and among Jewish youth in the United States, the percentage of those who do not identify with Israel and Zionism is in the rise in the last 15 years, which is very worrying for Israel. It's very worrying for Zionism. And it's developing. Look at the last elections in the United States and the participant of Jewish youth in Black Lives Matter movement. With all those youth in the countryside and in big cities, they consider themselves to be part of the liberal world rather than being part of Israel and Zionism. And they don't understand, they can't understand or justify how you condemn, for example, discrimination and racism in the United States, and when it comes to Israel, you don't condemn it. You know, there is a contradiction for them here. So they have to be consistent. If you are against racism, you are against racism everywhere. If you are against discrimination, you are against discrimination everywhere. So what we are witnessing is this kind of development, even among Jewish youth in the United States and in Europe, which is very promising, not very promising just only for Palestinians. It's very promising for the sake of democracy, for the sake of freedoms, of universal values, of liberties, and so on and so forth.
Thank you. And speaking about the history of repression and discrimination in Europe, I have to ask you about Norman Finkelstein's book, and I have mentioned him quite a few times now. His book, The Holocaust Industries. And for our viewers who haven't read the book, what Norman Finkelstein claims is that the history or the memory of the Holocaust is being exploited to further the policies of the Israeli government. So, what would you comment on this, on the Norman Finkelstein's book?
Look, Israel cannot claim that it represents either Holocaust survivors or Holocaust victims. Not only because Israel was not there when the Holocaust was perpetrated, but because it's a question of let me say humanity. It's a question of taking lessons from what happened in Europe at that period of time, and to come into terms with our own history, with our own atrocities, and also to admit that this happened also outside of Europe. Again, when we talk about Black Lives Matter, one of the big stories there is about the role of Jewish communities in support of blacks in the 70s of last century, in the 60s and 70s, and today, for so many black people movements in the United States, they consider the Jews to be part of the white establishment that inflicts discrimination upon them. And for some Jews, they consider that the Holocaust is the most atrocious human event in the modern history. Well, it was atrocious. There's no question about it. But we have to look around us to see atrocities that took place all over. Now, here's the hypocrisy in Europe. Because they are Jews or because they are white, why? So what Norman Finkelstein is trying to say is that first, Israel cannot come and claim that it represents those Jews. And by the way, Norman Finkelstein is born to Holocaust survivors.
Yes.
As a Jew. So what he says that it's not only a question of morality, it's a question of political righteousness, that Israel cannot claim that it represents them, and Israel is milking the states of Europe for so many years now. It milks them in terms of fund, military support, political support, and using the accusation of being anti-Semite against anyone who tries to criticize Israel. It's so powerful, and it has the ability to silence so many people around the world, including inside Europe. So this is why he called the book Holocaust Industry, because it tends to be some kind of very lucrative industry, very lucrative business in terms of its political outcomes, in terms of giving Israel the ability to silence Palestinians, to silence all those voices who stand in support of Palestinian rights. So it's very effective. It's very powerful weapon that Israel and Zionists are using all over the world, including in the United States, where you can stand and say, that, like that reverend once said, God not bless the United States of America, God damn the United States of America. That was in 2008. So no one came out and said, well, you can't say that. But I bet you if he came out and say, God damn Israel, that would be the most outrageous thing that you can say. So this is the hypocrisy, the kind of hypocrisy that Palestinians face. Israeli troops, Israeli police and border police attacked Al-Aqsa Mosque last week. Literally, they attacked prayers, worshippers inside not in the yard, inside the mosque itself. So imagine if anyone came and attacked a synagogue. So that's the whole thing about Holocaust industry.
I think this difference that you drew between the European outlook and the American outlook on Israel, and their also outlook towards Palestinians and the East in general, is very valuable. And so shifting the question from your perspective on Israel to their perspective on Palestine, do you think that there is an attitude of Orientalism is still present in the Western politics?
Can you just repeat your question slowly?
Yes.
Because I couldn't hear it.
So do you think that an perspective of Orientalism is still present in the Western policies towards Palestine?
Well, yes. We are still being seen through the lenses of not only the West, through the lenses of the Muslim world, the Arab world, and with all what comes with these two descriptions. With Muslims come, all kinds of accusations of being a terrorist or anti-democrat. We are the sort of the antithesis of liberalism, freedoms, and so on and so forth. And we are seen also through the lenses of being Arabs, Arabs of the Gulf, money, backwardness, and so on and so forth. This is the kind of stereotype that we are being looked upon through in the West, including, by the way, not only politicians, including in literature. If you read Edward Said's book, The Question of Palestine, in which he, spends pages and pages in reviewing few, novels, books of literature, in which the Palestinian is being looked upon as inferior to Jews and to Zionism, and in which Zionism is seen as the upper existence, and the Palestinians represent something really, really, really much way below this kind of European, sophisticated, white intellectuals, artisans, and so on and so forth. So this is part of the Oriental mentality through which Palestinians are being looked upon as Arabs, as Muslims, as part of the East, with all all those that come with this kind of depiction.
In the book you mentioned, The Question of Palestine, Said says something very important. He says, until 19th century, there was an imaginary line somewhere between Turkey and Greece that made anything beyond that point the East and the Oriental. But in 19th century, the Oriental stopped being this place of mysticism and unknown, and it became a real problem. But I think the interesting part that we see today is that the Oriental still preserves the prejudices it brings while incorporating it into the problems the East brings. Well, not the East, but the colonialism in the East brings. So what we have is both Orientalism and the problem of colonialism in one basket.
Yes, I can't agree more. Because I was on Zoom and on other meetings for a few hours now, is it possible to take questions or comments now?
Yes, I was just about to get to that, actually.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it.
So we have a few questions from the chat. I will entertain some of them. So this one is interesting. It is more of a statement than a question, but I'll form it in a question in a way that reminds a question. So this is actually about something we talked about. So he's one of our viewers say that since the question of Palestine, well, since the problem of Israel is not a local problem, the solution cannot be local. So he says that there needs to be universal and international resistance forces to solve it, like there was in 60s and 70s.
Well, this question has two dimensions, I think. The first one is that when you hear it, you think of the international intervention in the first place that created the whole question of Palestine. I'm talking here about United Kingdom, Britain, in the first place, who issued the Balfour Declaration in 1917. Then its direct intervention in Palestine, under which and by which Zionism was able to penetrate into Palestine. And then the partition resolution. So the whole question in Palestine started from the international community and international forces at some point of time. And for some people, they say, well, if there would be a solution, it should be through the direct intervention of the international community, who has to step in such an effective way and to guarantee that Palestinians would have their rights. On the other dimension of your question, is that there is no other way but making, putting Israel under direct pressure by peoples, by nations, by all those who believe in values of freedom, dignity, equality, and human rights. So and all of which is being part of the Palestinian suffering under occupation. So the more you can have people all over the world pressuring their governments by all available means, the stronger Palestinians will get in their struggle against Israeli occupation, discrimination, and settler colonialism. So there is no other way. If Israel do not feel that there should be a price for Israel to pay, then who will come and think that they should give up their occupation? If you are practicing your occupation without any pressure, why to contract? Why to let go?
Definitely right. I couldn't agree more. So, should we take another question?
Yes.
This one is interesting. What do you think the possibility is to establish an umbrella organization, a new organization of resistance, armed resistance, that doesn't, in effect, or obscure the traditional ones, but collects them under one organization?
Well, it's very hard to tell because the events are still unfolding, and they are unfolding in such a way that indicates the very well known so far that the strong the strong stronghold of resistance is in the Gaza Strip, and for so many years in the West Bank for so many reasons. The possibilities for armed struggle are very limited. So I don't see that there will be any kind of significant changes in this in the near future. But again, the way in the ways in which this open confrontation will go on, will unfold, may change, a lot of things all around us, and sometimes in very surprising ways.
Thank you. So we will take one last question and then end our live stream. So another one of our viewers asked, what is your perspective on the foreign policies of Turkey and Russia in Palestine?
Well, that's a question that is loaded with dynamite. First of all, we are talking about two major powers. Russia, on its own right, is seeking to retain what Russia thinks is the sort of the natural role in international politics. So for Russia, being part of the new balances in the Middle East is very crucial, and its ties and its developing relationships with Turkey, even though you have all those kinds of tensions between the two states. When it came, a couple of months ago, when it came to the war in Armenia, between Armenia and Azerbaijan, or when it came a few years ago, when it came to Syria. But still, the ability of these two states to overcome such critical events, very important events, tells volumes, tells a lot about their strategic thinking of how to establish some kind of, I don't want to say a bloc, but some kind of an alliance that would give both of them the opportunity for Turkey to have the full legitimacy and the full recognition by the United States and by Europe that Turkey is a major power, at least in the region, not if not in the world. And for Russia to have a stronghold in Turkey, Syria, and relationships with Iran, this is a very important strategic and geopolitical arch through which Russia sees its intervention in the region. Now, where Palestine comes in all of this, that's completely different question. So this is why for so many people, they can't understand that Russia is, is not that deeply involved with the Palestinian question, because Russia has its own relations with Israel, and it's very important when it comes to Syria or Iran. And the same for Turkey; it has long relations with Israel. And even though Turkey stands, politically speaking, now firmly against the atrocities and the policies of Israel, which in the past 10 or more years ago, it was, let me say, very costly for Turkey's interests in the region. So to strike a balance here between these strategic calculations and the question of Palestine is not an easy thing at all.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your answer, and thank you for joining us today in this live stream. I personally enjoyed it quite a lot, and I found all your answers very enlightening, and I'm sure our viewers also felt the same. Thank you again for participating
Thank
in
you.
today's meeting.
Thank you so much.